Hello and welcome to OLT 322, African American Literature, Lecture 3 on Frederick Douglass. My name is Warren Reed and we're going to hit some main points only. Firstly, one of the main ideas is that the narrative is about identity, about Frederick Douglass's quest for identity, and through him this search for identity for the slaves. But also he shows that slavery dehumanizes people. It dehumanizes both the slave and the slave master. And it does so through violence, both physical and psychological. The psychological violence occurs by keeping people ignorant and not letting them realize themselves, their full potential, by keeping them down, doing like animal labor almost. And also when they separate the children from their families, slaves from their families. This is a terrible psychological violence and left great scars. And these people grow up wondering who they are, as we mentioned in another lecture. And then the physical violence, obviously, there's all these beatings and whippings of the slaves. Douglass understands at some point that violence is a means to achieve his freedom. And through violence he gets a sense of rebirth. And through violence he understands about resistance. His first sense of awakening self-consciousness occurs in Baltimore when the wife of his master starts to teach him to read, and then the master finds out and forbids her to teach him because you don't want to give any advantages to the slaves. And then Frederick understood that, hey, wait a minute, he doesn't want me to read because he's afraid if I read something will happen. So he learns that anything the master doesn't want, Frederick Douglass or the slave should want. And that was a first idea of resistance, going after those things that the slave master forbids. Literacy then was a means to self-awareness and self-consciousness, and it was a form of resistance to learn to read. And then later he also uses violence when he fights with Covey, and it's a very big fight and they both get hurt in the fight, but he gains something, a sense of his self-worth. That's very, very important because a slave has no sense of self-worth. But when he stands up, he's stopped laying down and taking the beatings. He stands up and fights. Even though he gets hurt, he's not just passive anymore. And this informs not only his ideas, but also other later writers' ideas about freedom. Next, I want to talk about imagery. There's two kinds of imagery in the narrative. One is the imagery of seas and shipping. Now, when he was in Baltimore, he started to learn a trade in the shipbuilding industry, and so he was exposed to the sea and saw the ships coming and going freely in a way that he couldn't do. So ships represent that freedom. And if you take a ship out on the water, you're essentially free to go wherever you want to. Unlike a car, which has to go on the road usually, a ship can go pretty much anywhere on the sea. So both of those are associated closely with a sense of freedom. Also, if you think the ocean is vast, there's almost no limit to it. So it's totally the opposite of the life of a slave, which is confined and limited. Another set of imagery is that of animals. The slave master was treated the slaves as animals, beasts of burden, feeding them like animals. There's a passage where he compares their feeding to the feeding of pigs. And also the slave master themselves become animals. They become predators, preying on their fellow human beings when they treat them in such inhuman and unchristian-like ways. Frederick Douglass shows through his narrative that by awakening one's self-consciousness, one gets a sense of freedom, that you can change your circumstances and change your life for the better. And it's a lesson for all of us. If we're not happy in a situation, you have to think, what things can you change? And then, armed with that knowledge, you can start making those changes. Many of you are doing so by studying at the university, and that's very good. And the point is to follow through and do it with all your heart. I just want to point out again that you need to remember the slave narratives were not actually read by slaves as a rule, because slaves were not allowed to learn to read, and they didn't have any money anyway, so no money for buying books. The slave narrative was written as a tool to help the abolitionists in their efforts to make the voting white population, which means the white men, and the government to hate slavery. Before I go, I want to encourage you to download Frederick Douglass's narrative. It's on the Moodle, I've put it there, and you will really enjoy it, and I'm sure you will get many valuable lessons and understand more of the points made in the course material. My name is Warren Reed, and I'll see you in Lecture 4 on the Harlem Renaissance.